What if a painting from 1812 shows something that shouldn't exist, something that looks exactly like a nuclear blast? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why I walked into a gallery full of 19th century art and came out knowing our history had been edited. The painting is called The Great Fire, and it hangs in the Hermitage, just another canvas in a quiet hall of oil and varnish, officially labelled as Moscow burning in 1812. Except when you look closely, the light in that sky is wrong, violently wrong, like it belongs to a different century altogether. Let me show you something they don't teach in history class. I stood in front of that canvas for 3 hours while tourists drifted in, snapped photos, and walked away, and the guards kept glancing at me like he'd lost my mind. I couldn't leave, because the light over Moscow, the blinding white core fading out into sickly yellows and ashen reds, was familiar in a way it had no right to be. I'd seen it before in grainy footage of Hiroshima, in declassified reels of nuclear tests, that instantaneous whiteout, the world turning to pure exposure and then bleeding back into color. That's not how ordinary fire looks. That's the visual signature of something brighter than 1,000 suns, captured long before such a phrase was supposed to exist. And once you recognize it, you can unsee it, officially. The Great Fire is just that, a city consumed by accidental flames as Napoleon's only marches in. Nothing more exotic than arson and wind. That's the cover story printed on the little plaque. War, chaos, combustion, end of discussion. Except when you look closely, the illumination doesn't spread like a normal blaze. It explodes from a single, impossible epicenter, bleaching the horizon the way only a flash detonation does on modern film. The buildings closest to that core aren't just burning, they're dissolving into a haze, as if the pigment itself has been scorched off the canvas. And if an artist in 1812 painted the light of a weapon where it didn't exist yet, you have to ask, where did he see it? I know how insane that sounds. If I were you, it'd be suspicious too, because we've all been trained to file anything like this under fantasy or error. But standing there, with the museum's soft lights and polished floors behind me, I felt that jolt of cognitive dissonance you only get when two realities collide. What's retold, and what your eyes report. You might have felt it too, that quiet pressure in the back of your mind that says the official story doesn't quite add up, that there's a missing chapter no one wants to talk about. This wasn't just art anymore, it was forensic evidence hiding in plain sight. A painted aftermath of an event we're not allowed to remember, and that single canvas in the Hermitage is only the first crack in the wall. Let me show you what happens when you stop treating 1812 as a local story. In that single year, catastrophic fires took apart major cities across the northern hemisphere: Moscow in the east, and in the west New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Boston, Charleston, New Orleans, each one hit by a catastrophe big enough to make it into the record, officially. You're retold these are separate urban disasters, the kind that just happen in wooden cities. Except when you look closely, they don't behave like separate accidents at all. I found that when you lay the dates side by side, the fires don't spread like a chain reaction. They spike together, like someone hit multiple targets on the same grid. That is not how random chimney sparks and careless lamps behave. That's how simultaneous events look from a distance. And in the middle of this pattern, like a detonation at the center of a blast radius, sits Moscow, burning with a ferocity that rewrote its own climate. Because Moscow didn't just burn, it created its own weather system and heat intense enough to melt stone. And that level of thermal devastation forces you to ask what kind of fire we're actually talking about. Here's what they don't tell you when they talk about the War of 1812, as if it were an 1812, as if it were an neatly contained battlefields and borders. Cities along the young American coastline were also going up in catastrophic flames: New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Boston, Charleston, New Orleans, all in that same tight historical window. Russia and America were not at war with each other, and yet their cities burned as if caught in the same invisible crusheress. That's not a tidy narrative of nation versus nation, that's a shared exposure to something larger than any declared conflict. Let me explain something about coincidence. Past a certain scale, the word stops meaning anything. When multiple major population centers on different continents ignite in catastrophic fires in the same year, the burden of proof shifts. The burden moves from prove it's connected to prove it isn't. Except when you look closely at the way the story is told. Every fire is boxed off, labeled, and quarantined from the others as if connection itself were forbidden. That systematic separation of events is not neutral historiography. That's how you build a cover story. I started mapping the burned sites and years like a crime scene, and the pattern that emerged didn't look like urban bad luck, it looked like a coordinated extermination of infrastructure. Stone doesn't melt in normal city fires, where the systems don't spontaneously generate over a single burning town, and distant nations not at war don't watch their major cities incinerate in the same historical heartbeat without a common cause. That's not a series of accidents, that's the outline of a single, concealed operation drawn in ash and glass. But numbers and nets are only the skeleton. The real shock comes when you read what the people inside those fires actually saw. I started collecting eyewitness fragments like burnt paper, and the same phrase kept surfacing in different languages. Brighter than 1,000 suns. Long before Oppenheimer reached for those words, people who had no concept of nukes were grabbing at the exact same metaphor for impossible light. Official historians shrug it off as flowery speech, overwrought survivors dramatizing a normal fire. Except when you look closely, that phrase shows up precisely where the thermal intensity is off the charts and the destruction is instantaneous, not gradual. And once you see that, you start reading the timing of the light and sound very differently. Let me show you what I mean about timing. Over and over, the pattern is identical. First, a blinding flash. So intense people say the world vanished into white, then a suspended, uncanny silence only after that. The roar and the wind and the fire arriving all at once, as if switched on. That's not how a conventional blaze behaves. Normal fires crawl. They don't detonate reality and then let the sound catch up. That's not urban combustion. That's the classic signature of a nuclear detonation: light outrunning sound, thermal pulse preceding blast wave. And it's one thing to infer that in theory, it's another when a soldier walks the blast field and sketches what the trees look like. I found that soldier's account buried in a compilation, one paragraph no one quotes. He writes of whole stands of trees burnt but still standing, bark seared away, all their limbs and trunks leaning in the same direction, pointing away from the city center like arrested compasses. That's not random wind, that's a radial blast pattern. The exact footprint you see when a pressure wave slams through, and everything yields the same way. The official story files it under strong storm and moves on, as if storms ignite cities in an instant. What do you think is really driving the uncertainty here? Tell me in the comments. Then there's the Russian doctor, the one whose notes don't fit any 19th century battlefield manual. He describes patients with skin blistered and blackened in precise outlines where clothes had been, but with no continuous flamed image around them. Hair falling out in clumps days later, mouths filling with blood, vomiting that wouldn't stop, people who looked uninjured at first and then collapsed from the inside out. That's not infection, and it's not ordinary burns. That's a textbook description of acute radiation syndrome written before radiation existed as a concept. And if the testimonies of light, sound, blessed, and sickness all carry the same fingerprint, then the next step is obvious. You stop asking what people believed happened and start asking what kind of weapon leaves that pattern on both flesh and stone. Here's what they don't tell you about Moscow in 1812. The Great Fire, the one you're told was set by retreating Russians and looters, began the same day Napoleon entered the city. Almost immediately after his troops walked in, he hadn't had time to disperse arson squads through every district, to rig whole neighborhoods with fuel, to create a firestorm that would swallow stone. The official narrative treats this as coincidence. Army enters, city erupts. Except when you look closely at the timing, it doesn't read like a trigger was waiting for a signal. I found campaign records that talk about the state of Napoleon's army by October, before the legendary winter even arrived. He went in with around 600,000 men, a force big enough to terrify a continent, and yet within weeks he was marching out with broken remnants, shattered long before ice and snow could be blamed. Let us describe units that simply withered, horses dropping, men too weak to stand, as if something had hollowed them out from the inside. French scouts rode ahead and fouled, something no one can explain, empty. Intact towns, doors open, food on tables, no bodies, just absence, the great silence stretching for miles. That's not the chaos of battle, that's what the landscape looks like when people have moved out before the catastrophe, not during it. Let me show you what the ground itself remembers from that silence. Across parts of Russia, there are pools of glass, not crafted objects, but frozen lakes and rivulets where something melted sand and masonry into smooth, fused sheets. To reach that state, you need temperatures above 1400 degrees Celsius, the kind of thermal devastation you associate with weapons brighter than 1,000 suns, not with wooden roofs and household fires. These glass fields don't sit neatly inside old kiln sites, and they're not localized like a factory accident. They sprawl, as if a wave of heat rolled over the land and left it liquefied in its wake. But the glass is only the first layer of the confession. The stone goes deeper. I went looking at the oldest surviving buildings, the ones everyone agrees predate 1812. On their faces you find scorch marks that aren't such you can scrape away, but discoloration driven into the material itself, into the crystal lattice of the stone, as if the heat didn't just lick the surface, it penetrated to the molecular level. That's not candle smoke, and it's not a neighborhood fire. That's the signature of short, impossible heat, the kind that alters matter from the inside. Beneath multiple major Russian cities, at the same depth in the soil, there's a distinct hash band, a dark, burned horizon that archaeologists label a cultural discontinuity. A polite phrase for everything above this layer belongs to a different world than everything below it. That's not gradual evolution of a society, that's a reset line, a point where something wiped the slate and the rebuild started on top of a grave. And if one empire carries this buried burn mark under its foundations, you have to ask the next question: who else in 1812 was standing on that same line of ash? I found the same year stamped on disasters half a world away. In 1812, while Moscow burned, Caracas shook with what the papers called an earthquake, except the ground didn't just shake, it burned, and the buildings didn't just crack, they slumped, as if some invisible furnace had softened them from below. At the same time, volcanic eruptions roared through the Caribbean, and the official story says geologically active region, as if that explains the timing lining up with the infernos in the north. That's not one unlucky year on one continent, that's he tripling through a system, triggered in sequence. When you keep following the dates and the flames, the pattern stops looking local. Because while the Atlantic world was supposedly just fighting conventional wars, catastrophic fires tore through major Asian cities in that same 1812 window, whole districts going up with a speed and ferocity blamed on crowded wooden houses and careless residents. Except when you look closely, the language repeats fire that appears everywhere at once, structures failing, as if the material itself has been weakened, not just scorched. On 3 continents, in one slice of time, the sky and the ground behave like someone is switching the same weapon on and off. That's not coincidence, that's simultaneous, coordinated destruction using a technology that can reach across oceans. So you have to ask if it was coordinated. Who was the target? Here's what they don't tell you when they talk about these unrelated disasters. The target was Russia, or America, or a handful of Asian ports. Those are just the names we use now. The target was a network, an infrastructure, what fragments of old maps and legends later generations would compress into one phrase. The Tartarian Empire, a supposedly advanced globalization that doesn't fit the primitive timeline we're handed in school. Wipe the grid, erase the architecture, burn the archives, then rename the blast zones as new nations rebuilding. That's not organic rise and fall, that's an extermination followed by a reset masquerading as progress. And once you see that, the ancient texts stop reading like fantasy. Let me show you how far back this technology's shadow goes. In one of the oldest surviving epics, the Mahabharata, you get descriptions of weapons so devastating, so absolute. They sound like they were written by someone watching a nuclear test from the ground. Blinding light, instant annihilation, an aftermath that poisons what it touches. Scholars wave it away as metaphor, as poetic excess, as if ancient people didn't know the difference between a bonfire and a sun falling to earth. That's not superstition on the page, that's technical memory wrapped in myth, so it could survive the last purge. And if the stories remember the weapon, the ground remembers too, because there's a place whose bones match the pages Mohenjo minus Darrow. On the surface, it's just another ancient ruin, an archaeological site picked clean for pottery and floor plans. But the material tells a different story. Stone turned to glass in places, vitrification frozen mid-minus melt, and radiation levels higher than what you'd expect from time and dust alone. That's the same thermal devastation signature we saw in the 1812 glass pools and the molecular scorch in the stone. But on a far older layer of the world, that's not a single freak event, that's a recurring weapon, deployed in cycles, each time followed by a cultural discontinuity and a new cover story. And once you understand that, the scale of what happened in 1812, and what they had to erase to hide it, stops being just tragic and becomes something else, a global reset carried out on the bones of giants. So when you put all of that together, the blast patterns, the glass, the silence, you hit a wall where the official story just disintegrates, and something darker steps out from behind it. They told you it was Napoleon's invasion. They told you it was the War of 1812, clear lines of battle and flags on maps, human minus scale motives for human minus scale destruction. Except when you look closely, those wars line up perfectly with the footprint of a systematic nuclear bombardment of Tartarian cities, a coordinated extermination masquerading as conventional conflict. That's not coincidence, that's a cover story laid over a blast map. And once you see that, the campaigns of 1812 stop looking like strategy and start looking like targeting coordinates. Here's what they don't tell you in those neat textbook timelines. History after 1812 was rewritten as damage control. Cities accidentally burned, arsenals mysteriously exploded, entire districts disappeared in unprecedented storms and acts of God, each one carefully filed under a different excuse so no one would connect the pattern. That's not bad record minus keeping, that's a deliberate dismemberment of a single global event into disconnected tragedies, so no one would ever say the word Tartaria again. They buried the extermination under stories of heroism, incompetence and weather, but paper can lie, stone and glass can't. I found a letter from 1820, written by a British engineer who had walked through the ruins and didn't yet know what he was supposed to believe. He wrote that the destruction he saw was beyond the capacity of any army, that no artillery he knew could do this, and that the stones themselves showed signs of impossible heat. That's not fiery language, that's a man groping for words around the thermal devastation signature of a nuclear strike before the turn existed. His confusion is the sound of the cover story still being built around him, and it exposes what came next, because after 1812, the world doesn't just rebuild, it simplifies. Architecture loses its impossible confidence, its grand integrated systems, its towering complexity, and slumps into cruder, cheaper, more forgetful forms. Knowledge that had been embodied in stone and mechanism is reduced to sketches and speculation. That's not organic progress, that's what a civilization reset looks like when survivors without the keys try to copy the ruins of giants. The ornate bones of Tartarian cities become templates for lesser imitations, while the advanced layer that made them function vanishes from the manuals. And that abrupt cultural discontinuity is the footprint of the reset they needed to hide the weapon, which leaves us here, walking through their aftermath, mistaking a post-minus extermination salvage operation for the beginning of our story. We are the remnants who have forgotten, raised on cover stories about brave generals and unlucky fires, told never to question why stone looks melted and why entire styles of building and knowing appear fully formed, then vanish. But the materials haven't forgotten the scorch marks at the molecular level, the pools of glass, the ash lying beneath our foundations, all carry the memory of a brighter minus the minus sun's moment our textbooks refuse to name. And that painting in the museum, the one that showed an impossible light of the 1812 Moscow that I told you about at the start, is not an artist's exaggeration. It's the last honest witness on the wall to a nuclear night that reset the world.